Welcome to the Red Piranha Knowledge Sprint Sessions, a series of short videos centered around cybersecurity and ways to protect your assets from the constantly evolving threat landscape that all organizations and individuals face. My name is Ben Aylett and I'm the Product Manager for Red Piranha, and I'm joined by Damien Peters and Adrian Goff from our security team. In this video, we ask, if EDRs don't stop or detect Cobalt Strike, what will? Before we start, a quick overview. There are three parts to this video. We'll explain Cobalt Strike, give an insight into EDR bypass and provide an example of the Cobalt Strike kill chain with approaches to interrupting the kill chain using Crystal Eye. I'll now hand over to Adrian, who will take you through Cobalt Strike.
Thanks, Ben. Hello, everyone. My name's Adrian, and I'm a penetration tester and security analyst with Red Piranha. So we'll be running through what is Cobalt Strike. So Cobalt Strike is an offensive security tool that's used for adversary simulations and red team operations. So it's a fully featured command and control framework with the following advanced features. So the first advanced feature would be reconnaissance. So they provide a module that can map the client-side attack surface in a compromised network to identify known vulnerabilities that threat actors can then use to leverage their capabilities. The next one is they have covert communication. So obviously they got to talk with a listener and a command and control server. So this is for external communications as well as lateral movement within a network between listeners. Collaboration as well. So they have a team server which allows groups to share access to compromised systems. They have attack packages. So this provides a framework to generate malicious payloads and files. They even have packages to generate malicious Microsoft Word documents, Excel files, etc. That can be used for phishing. They have a very advanced post-exploitation framework. So there's many tools in here, and you can use those tools to perform techniques such as privilege escalation to gain higher rights on the computer they're on, perform lateral movement to move within the network, perform keystroke logging, and several other advanced modules that they provide. They also provide browser pivoting. So this is a pretty cool feature. It injects web requests into a victim's browser, and then they can gain access to any authenticated sessions that the victim may have in their browser. So obviously this can be used to bypass 2FA as well if a victim's already logged into a website. And they also have a spear phishing module. So they can use this to deploy listeners on a victim computer through phishing campaigns. Obviously, they would harness the attack packages to generate something malicious, like a malicious Word document as well. So yeah, due to Cobalt Strike's advanced features, ease of use, and availability, it's widely being used by threat actors in the wild.
It's a pretty comprehensive tool. It's like a Swiss Army knife for bad guys.
Yeah, it is indeed. So if anyone's aware of the Metasploit framework, it's very similar to that for post-exploitation activities and actually communicating between compromised hosts and an external network. So yeah, they package a lot of really cool features in the package. But yeah, it's very easy to use as well because it's all using the same fundamental framework to do things. So yeah, it's very easy to use as well. So this slide here is just showing an example of a team server user interface. So up top here, you've got the pivot table. So this can show like the compromised host in a victim network, and it shows how they can communicate as well back to the C2. So some of like you can actually pivot through many machines and use a separate path to talk back to the command and control. So typically you would probably only have one machine in an entire network that talks back to the command and control server. and then you can use that parent listener to communicate with child listeners as well. Just at the bottom of the screen here, you see a bunch of tabs. So these are all the listeners that they've deployed on the network. And then you can use this console to be able to execute tasks and download data and perform any operation on the victim's machine. So this slide's talking about listeners. So obviously you got a command and control server on the outside, and then that you require a listener to be able to communicate with that. So Cobalt Strike listeners are deployed on compromised machines, and they're used to communicate with the team server as well as listeners on the local network. So how they communicate is pretty important for us in wanting to be able to detect Cobalt Strike. The typical protocols that they support right now are HTTP, HTTPS, and DNS when they're doing external communications to the team server. And the supported protocols for communicating internally within a network is typically raw TCP and SMB using named pipes. So this image on the right here shows the UI for creating a new listener. So you can see the types of beacons that I mentioned before. This Cobalt Strike's highly customizable though. So if you do want to use external tools, etc., external C2s, or maybe like a Metasploit reverse shell, like an interpreter session or something like that, they certainly support that. It's highly configurable, so you can just set it up that way. And this image on the left here is just showing a list of listeners that they've already deployed on a local network. So it tells you like what sort of beacon they've used, what port and protocol they're using, and where it's hosted as well. So obviously the main idea of Cobalt Strike is to be able to infiltrate and exfiltrate data out of the network, like sort of like a communication network, right? So there's a couple of ways they can do it depending on the beacon type they use. So if you use a DNS beacon, you can infiltrate and exfiltrate data using DNS records. So they support text records, A records, and quad A records. So typically the data is actually stored in a subdomain for a host. So because they're infiltrating and exfiltrating data, the subdomains are quite long in length. So it's actually fairly simple to detect anomalies in that just due to the length of the subdomains. So yeah, that's how they do it with DNS records. If they use a HTTP beacon, there's two ways you can infiltrate and exfiltrate data. So the first one is to use a HTTP GET request. So this is used to talk to the team server to download tasks. So any commands or scripts they want to run on the compromised host, they can use this to be able to get the outstanding tasks. And they can also, if you want to egress data out of the network, you do that using HTTP post request as well. So yeah, so there's a bit of a difference between DNS and HTTP. DNS is a bit slower and it's a bit more finicky to get data out because there is restrictions on the data lengths available. So HTTP is faster, but DNS is a bit more stealthy as well. So the image on the right here is just showing a little bit of a setup for how DNS works on the with Cobalt Strike. So you've got a compromised system on the left here, and it's trying to talk back to a team server with the domain 1234.profiles.losenolove.com. So because it's DNS, it'll talk to a local DNS server. That probably doesn't have it because it's not a common request in the local network. So then it goes out to other external DNS servers until it can figure out where the team server is living. So this next slide shows the typical Cobalt Strike infrastructure setup. So on the left here, you've got a victim network. For simplicity's sake, you got just a server and a workstation. And then on the right here, you've got the command and control server, as well as the threat actors' computers that they use to connect to it. And at the top here, you've got the internet, and they use servers like redirectors as well to be able to proxy the traffic to the command and control server. So these redirectors, they use these to mask the true identity of where the command and control server really is located. So it's much easier for them to be able to deploy a new redirector and set up a new domain and IP address. So when threat intelligence picks up and determines that it's a malicious domain or IP, they can quickly spin up a new server to be able to mask that they're malicious, and then redirect that to the actual command and control server. So as mentioned before, there's different protocols used depending on if it's external or internal communications. So you can see the HTTPS protocol is used to talk to the redirectors and then send it over to the command and control server, while listeners within the network are talking over SMB protocol using named pipes as well. So yeah, I'll pass it over to Damien to discuss EDR bypasses.
Thank you for that, Adrian. So when it comes to EDR bypass techniques, there are quite a few out there. I will just be covering 3 common methods used by threat actors to achieve EDR bypass. So that is endpoint detection. The first one that they usually use is reflective DLL loading, which basically this technique allows these malicious DLL files to be injected into a process from the memory instead of from the disk. This basically allows basically reduces the artifacts caused by loading this DLL, as well as evading the EDR, as checking memory is quite difficult as well. The second one is something called direct syscalls. This technique uses low-level syscalls to invoke system functions, as some EDRs only look at higher level when API or NT-API calls. You can think of this as looking the difference between assembly and C++, essentially, when it comes to coding. And unhooking, very similar to web proxy in concept. It's basically the process of removing hooks placed on applications by systems such as EDRs to intercept function calls. So what happens here is EDRs, as endpoint detection, they place hooks onto various applications to inspect them and intercept function calls, making sure that nothing dangerous is happening. And in the process of unhooking, you're basically getting rid of that EDR's hook so they can't intercept the function calls. This is where network detection can help. Say they've bypassed EDR, you now have the next layer of defense, which is network detection and response. This helps with detecting and preventing threats as well. One of the many functions NDR can help is due to the abundance of threat intelligence being incorporated into proper NDR solutions, as well as alerts being fed into a SOC for constant monitoring as well. Piranha does provide threat visibility with our own integrated threat intelligence system, as well as our local managed threat feeds. We also provide an integrated MDR, which is managed detection and response for 24/7 eyes on glass monitoring for your network as well. We'll now have Adrian walk you through how Crystal Eye can assist you with detecting Cobalt Strike in the various chains of the cyber kill chain. Thanks, Adrian.
Thanks, Damien. So yeah, we're starting to get to the interesting part of the talk now. So this image just shows an example kill chain for a Cobalt Strike attack. So this is a pretty interesting one. This one is a attack which uses phishing to get onto the target, and then to be able to deploy a listener and talk back to the command and control server. So these yellow boxes here are potential steps in the process that we could use to block the attempted exploit. So yeah, if you have a defense in depth approach, there's many different parts of the kill chain that you can use to be able to stop the attack before it's actually completed. So as with any phishing campaign, properly setting your DMARC, DKIM, and SPF records is highly beneficial, as it stops attackers from spoofing your email address and other sort of attack methods that you can do through email. So I highly recommend you set up those sort of records. So for Red Piranha, the first place that we could potentially stop the threat is using our secure email gateway. So this is where you can scan the emails for virus and malicious files, and it's the first attempt. If it gets through the email gateway, then it'll be dropping the listener onto the target. So then you're up to endpoint EDR to detect it. So if EDR doesn't detect it, and then it'll be trying to run the code. So you'll be able to use application whitelisting as a potential method of blocking it. So if you set up application whitelisting, you'll be able to stop malicious applications from running, as they wouldn't be in the whitelist. So that's one extra area you could stop it. The next one's coming up to instrumentation and telemetry. So for Crystal Eye, this would be our RDS IPS system. So then we're starting to see the listener trying to communicate back with the command and control server. Again, we got additional steps with our advanced firewall and secure gateway for firewall and proxy protection. So if you have outbound rules that could potentially block it, as well as seeing malicious traffic such as raw TCP connections, that's also another method of detecting it and stopping it. And if that fails, then our SOC analyst will be able to review events and maybe correlate all these events and determine that it's actually malicious activity associated with Cobalt Strike. If it gets through all these layers of defense, then it's actually already connected to the command and control server, and it's starting to do post-exploitation activities. So there's still potential to detect it after this, as our RDPS is still looking at network connections within the internal network. So they may be able to detect malicious connections using raw TCP and SMB and those sorts of things. So yeah, this is just a typical kill chain for a potential attack. So this is where Crystal Eye comes into place in the defense and left idea. So we've got many modules that can help through the different steps of the kill chain to potentially stop these attacks. So up here we got like host-based firewall. We got network, RDS and IPS. We got the secure web gateway. We got the secure email gateway, and a couple of other modules as well that can help. So yeah, these for Crystal Eye, we implement several layers of defense to be able to detect Cobalt Strike at different stages of the kill chain. So going in order of that kill chain, as I already mentioned, we got the secure email gateway. So we got virus protection and spam filtering on that one. So potentially detect malicious files and links within the email address. We can then use the advanced firewall. So if you had firewall settings blocking certain ports going outbound, or certain rules on lateral movement, like talking within the internal network, you can potentially block those without even like knowing. We also have a firewall audit graph, which helps visualize how the firewall is working to see if there's any holes in your system. The next one would be our RDS and IPS system. So we have a built-in automated actionable intelligence program, which is consistently detecting malicious domains and IP addresses and updating them throughout all crystal-wide deployments. So if one of our clients sees malicious scanning or malicious activity, we then implement that throughout all crystallized that our clients have. Obviously, we've got advanced signature-based detection methods, so we can detect certain known IOCs as well as potentially dynamic IOCs as well. And as Damien already mentioned, we have a pipeline of cyber threat intelligence, such as the Cyber Threat Alliance. So this is where major players in the game share intelligence throughout the community. So then we'll be able to get the latest sources on the latest malicious domains and IP addresses and other IOCs like that. And we can implement them into our detection process. So we also have secure email gateway. So we highly recommend turning this on because this performs SSL/TLS inspection. So if it is using a HTTPS beacon, you would need to turn secure web gateway on to be able to inspect that traffic and look for any IOCs in there. Obviously, we've also got proxies, so the transparent and explicit proxy, depending on what suits your business, as well as additional signature-based detection using such like technologies as Yara. Crystal AI also has some endpoint applications that you can deploy on your host to help harden the systems. So you already mentioned application whitelisting. So you can set up a whitelist of approved applications that are able to talk to the external network. So it's highly recommended turning that on. So then you can just block any malicious program that's trying to talk back to a C2 server on the internet, as it's not allowed. And we also have endpoint hardening rules that we can turn on to help harden the system, such as blocking like Excel macros and stuff like that. We also have data loss prevention, so you can set that up. You can set up signatures to detect if certain files are getting exfiltrated outside of the network, and that will generate alarms to our SOC team to let you know that. So this next slide, we'll just talk about some of the known IOCs for Cobalt Strike. I guess I'll start with so Cobalt Strike has been cracked in the past. So because it's been cracked, like it's quite an expensive tool. I think it starts at $8,000 per license. So threat actors prefer just to use cracked instances of it, which is good for us as defenders, as the cracked versions typically have hard-coded IOCs, which make them easier to detect than the paid versions, where it's highly customizable and they can change that over time. So obviously some known IOCs through the threat intelligence landscape, malicious domains and IP addresses get updated all the time. As I said, we already feed these. So with other players in the industry, we update our rules to detect all these known malicious domains and IP addresses. As well as the team server uses a default port of 550 on TCP. This is the default port for the team server to communicate back with clients. So if you detect any traffic using that port outbound, there's potential that it's a Cobalt Strike beacon trying to talk back to the command and control server. So should certainly be looked into further. Obviously, they provide default TLS certificates as well. So these default certificates have already been fingerprinted heavily. It's very easy to be able to detect these as well. Yep. For the beacons, if you're using a HTTP beacon, there's a number of different default URIs that are set up. So if there's a request to Stager or Stager 64 or beacon.http.post, these are well-known default Cobalt Strike team server links. So if we see any of this traffic, we'll be able to detect it and look into it further, as it's likely Cobalt Strike trying to talk back to the C2 server. As well as in the internal network, as I said, they use SMB pipes to be able to communicate, and the default named pipe is this one here. So you'll be able to determine if these sorts of pipes are being used in your network to be able to detect that. So before I go on to the next slide, just for an example with this TLS certificate, have a look at 6E. It starts with 6E and ends with 7C. So this is an example of a malicious domain. So this is pretty recent. It was created 11 days ago, and it has a default TLS certificate. As you can see, that fingerprint is the same as the default one. So sometimes it's fairly easy to be able to detect Cobalt Strike if they're using default settings like this as well. So just going to pass it back to Damien, and he'll discuss a bit more in depth on some of the crystalline features that can help prevent Cobalt Strike from infiltrating your network.
Yep, thanks for that, Adrian. So we've been talking a lot about network-based security and basically how to detect them within the network, but the Crystal Eye itself can also do policy and risk control. It basically allows a lot of granular control over network policies that can be applied across multiple tenants if required, and these settings should be configured based on the company's risk policy to prevent potential threats or mitigate impact of threats, essentially. These are just some of the features Crystal Eye allows you control over, such as control over what file extensions are allowed, what MIME types should be allowed, domain groups should be blocked, allowed, protocol filtering, and application filtering. And just as an example, you can see on the protocol filtering, you can block all these different types of file sharing services as well. So if they're not required within your company, such as a BitTorrent, you can block it on a network-based level. But using the endpoint app Caesar as well, you can block it on the endpoint device as well for even more defense in depth. So we're just going through a very quick example on how easy it is to create network-based policies on the Crystal Eye. So here's just a simple one. We just named it block exe download, and we are simply just blocking the file extensions exe and MSI, which are both executables. And after you've made that, when someone tries to download any exe or MSI file, there will be an alert created on the Crystal Eye as well as on our SOC or SIEM. And the SOC teams will, you can even escalate this for the SOC team to further investigate. So at the bottom picture, we can see that's the actual alert being generated on the Crystal Eye. We can see banned file extension, exe. And once you click that, you'll be greeted with this. You can see the host name, the full URI that was accessed. You can allow it if it was a false positive, or you can escalate it if it does require further investigation as well. And even the endpoint user will get alerted as well, so they're aware of this as well. But just as I mentioned earlier, you can do network-based control, and using Caesar, you can control all of these things as well as harden the endpoint device itself for even further protection. So you have all the way from ingress to egress for protection for policies as well.
Thanks Damien and Adrian for taking the time to help us understand more about EDR bypass, Cobalt Strike, and some of the NDR features offered by Crystal Eye XDR products that can close the gap in your security stack. If you enjoyed this video, there are more available at our YouTube channel. Look for the link in the description for the Knowledge Sprint playlist. For the latest in upcoming live webinars and in-person events, go to redpiranha.net/events. You can join our community at forum.redpiranha.net and find out more about Red Piranha by visiting our website at redpiranha.net.